What's going on, everybody? Kalupa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE and going over whether or not this camera setup is good enough for daily use. Now keep in mind, there are two different versions of the Samsung Galaxy A13. There's the A13 5G that came out in December of 2021, and then the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE that came out only a few months ago. Now this phone in this video is the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE, and these two phones do have completely different camera setups. So if you do want to see the camera setup of the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G, I have made a video about that as well. And I will be comparing these two phones directly in another video, so stay tuned for that. But with the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE, this is a pretty interesting device because on one hand, it has a lot of strengths like an amazing display and a full camera setup, but it also has a really slow processor and a pretty cheap design overall, so the strengths and weaknesses do kind of balance out. But I'm going to be going over the various camera features of this phone and showing you a bunch of different photos to help you decide whether or not this camera setup is good enough for you. Now if you want to learn more about this phone's specs and features, be sure to check out my full regular review of it on the channel. But otherwise, let's get started. So to start off, let's take a look at the selfie camera. Now this is a pretty average camera for a lower end phone. It's 8 megapixels, so not super powerful, but also not too weak either. And of course, we got a water drop notch for the design, which is pretty standard in a lower end Samsung phone. To give you an idea of what this camera can do, here's a photo taken indoors in pretty high lighting. Now keep in mind, all the lights in this room are daylight colored, so we got that really bright white light. It's not cold per se, but compared to a normal light that you might find in a bedroom or a living room, there's going to be a lot less warmth and less color in general. Now in this photo, the lighting is still pretty adequate, but it's a lot lower. In the first photo, I was basically surrounded by a bunch of really bright lights and studio lights, but in this photo, it's basically just a living room with normal lighting. Now keep in mind, the lights used in this photo are the normal soft white color that you typically find in most living areas. So in general, these lights are a lot warmer than the previous photo, and overall, unless you're outside or something, I feel like this is the type of lighting most people are going to be taking selfies in, because I'm going to guess the average person doesn't have a bunch of studio lights in their bedroom. Now this photo was taken in pretty much the worst lighting I could possibly find without it being completely dark, and I'm actually surprised at how well it came out. Sure, it doesn't look amazing or anything, but if you're taking photos for Snapchat, for example, where the quality isn't super important, the selfie camera on this phone will definitely at least get the job done. Now here's a photo taken outside in pretty much the most ideal lighting possible, and of course I was using portrait mode here, and I gotta say, for just being an entry-level phone, this photo does look really good. The details, color, everything looks really nice, and portrait mode also works surprisingly well. Now this photo on the other hand was taken at a slightly different angle, pretty much the same lighting, same picture, everything, but as you can see, this one doesn't look so good. So when you're taking selfies and pictures in general, definitely keep the lighting and angle in mind, because even the slightest changes will make a huge difference. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is, despite this not being the highest end selfie camera out there, with the right angles and conditions, you can definitely get some nice pictures with it. Now moving on to the main camera setup, with the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE, for being just an entry-level phone, we actually got a surprisingly good camera setup here. So this phone has a 50 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So as far as the actual features go, this phone has pretty much everything you could ask for in a non-flagship phone. Funny enough, it's actually even better than the 5G equivalent of this phone, because for whatever reason, the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G doesn't have an ultra wide camera. But taking a look at some photos from the main camera, we do have some real nice quality here. The details, colors, light, everything looks really good. Now of course, these photos aren't going to be nearly as good as something like a $1,400 flagship phone, for example, but for a lower end Samsung phone like this, I do think this main camera is pretty good. I think the main weakness here is that compared to a higher end phone, like for example maybe the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G, the colors aren't quite as bright, they look a little bit on the dull side, whereas with a higher end phone they're a lot bolder and more vivid. But in general, again, for the most part, these photos are really good, and for the average user, this camera will get the job done. Here's some photos taken with the ultra-wide camera. Now clearly this is not the best ultra-wide camera out there. There's a lot of distortion and the photos do look a little fuzzy, but it does at least get the job done. And again, remember, this is a pretty low-end device compared to something like a Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra. So on one hand, if you want that really high quality and you're using the ultra-wide camera for a more professional purpose, then yeah, you're probably going to want a higher-end device than this. But if you're more of a casual user and you just want to get that wider angle from time to time, then I would say this ultra-wide camera is at least good enough. Now here's some photos taken with the macro camera. In general, I did find the macro camera to be surprisingly impressive. Maybe not quite as good as some of the higher end Samsung Galaxy A series phones, but actually pretty close. So if you do want to get those more close-up detailed images, I would say the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE will be a decent choice. Here's a couple photos taken with portrait mode on the rear camera. Just like with the selfie camera, portrait mode works real well. So if you want to get a lot of pictures with those nice blurred out backgrounds, the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE will be a good choice. So overall, I feel like the camera is really this phone's biggest strength. Not only does it have a ton of features, especially for an entry-level phone, but the photo quality itself is also really good too. I feel like the only real weak link as far as quality goes is the ultra-wide camera. The photos aren't really bad per se, especially considering the price range of this phone, but at the same time, they're definitely not really usable for a whole lot. Like for example, if I were taking a vacation photo for social media, I probably wouldn't use one of the photos from this ultra-wide camera just because they look a little bit too fuzzy and distorted. But then again, the feature is still there, and that's more than you can say for a lot of phones like this. Now, one interesting thing about this camera you might not know is that when you're taking a regular photo with the rear camera, you're not actually using the full 50 megapixels. But that being said, with a special aspect ratio in the camera app, you actually can do this. So I'm going to show you some examples from that. So here are some photos taken using the high megapixel mode. As you can probably tell, they are much higher quality, but keep in mind these photos do take up a little bit more space. Now in my experience, it doesn't make a huge difference overall. They're more like 10 to 20 megabytes each, which isn't a whole lot. But if you're taking a lot of photos, it does add up. So if you do want to use this mode often, I do recommend getting a micro SD card. Now as far as video goes with this phone, we got a max recording quality of 1080p at 30 frames per second in both the rear and front cameras, so pretty standard. And overall, if you're recording YouTube videos, vlogs, or something more serious, I wouldn't really recommend this phone for it, but I'm gonna let the quality speak for itself because depending on your specific preferences and standards, it may or may not be good enough for you. So take a look at this quick sample. Here's a video test with the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE. We are recording in 1080p right now, which is the max quality. Also keep in mind what the audio sounds like. Autofocus is pretty decent. So in general, the video quality itself really isn't that bad. The picture, details, colors, light, everything looks pretty decent, but the stabilization is definitely not the best compared to something like a higher end device, maybe a Samsung Galaxy A53 5G for example. You're gonna get much smoother B-roll with a phone like that, and the audio is probably the worst part here. Again, if you're recording vlogs or something like that where you're actually relying on the built-in mic of the phone, I definitely wouldn't recommend this device because there are phones out there with much better audio quality. But if you're just making videos for social media or Snapchat for example, where the quality might not be super important but you still want it to be decent, then this phone will at least do that. But in conclusion, is the camera setup of the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE good enough for daily use? For almost everyone, I would say yes. Whether you're taking a selfie using portrait mode, getting a close-up image with the macro camera, or just using the regular photo mode, this phone is going to get you some real good quality photos, and it's absolutely going to be good enough for stuff like social media and any other more casual kind of purpose. Now that being said, if your standards for good photos are really high, if you want them to be DSLR level, or anything near the level of a $1,400 flagship phone, then you will be disappointed here because while this phone does take really good photos, remember at the end of the day this is still an entry-level phone, and for its price it can really only be so good. In addition to this, I don't really think the video is the best. The image itself is okay, but the stabilization is not the best, so again the footage is going to be a little wobbly no matter what you do, and you can't record 4K videos or even a higher frame rate. So as far as the actual video quality goes, with this phone the options are going to be pretty limited. And in addition to this, again the audio quality of this phone is really not very good, so if you're recording videos with a built-in mic, maybe you're vlogging or something like that, it's definitely not going to be YouTube quality. In my opinion, it's barely Snapchat quality. So unless you have an external microphone, which for a phone like this really isn't worth it, if you're recording videos like that, you're probably going to want a higher end device. But in general, aside from the video quality and the ultra-wide camera being a little fuzzy, I do think the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE does have a really good camera setup, and for most people, it's absolutely going to be good enough for daily use. Now, if you want to learn more about the phone itself, definitely check out my full review of it on the channel, because after all, this is an interesting device with some pretty specific strengths and weaknesses. But this concludes my camera review for the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to follow Kalipa's Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next one.